series. Thanks for coming. I always feel bad on a beautiful sunny day like this, but it's going to be worth being in here for the next hour. I see quite a few familiar faces and a few new folks. Could you raise your hand if you haven't been to a Science at Cal lecture before? Okay, handful. So definitely invite you to visit our website, scienceatcal.berkeley.edu, or just Google Science at Cal. Sign up for our mailing list. These lectures take place on the third Saturday of every month. And next month, on June 16th, we have Anand Varma, who's a photographer. Check out his work online, incredible photographs and incredible stories of, in particular, a journey to photograph a volcano in Patagonia, I think. And there's photos, sort of self-portraits of this guy caked in ash, and he's writing this blog about how he's having second thoughts as he's going through this ash is raining down on his head, but he wants to get his photograph, and really kind of dedicated to his art. So I think that one's going to be really exciting. Unfortunately, I'm going to be out of town, so I'm going to miss it, but we also video all our talks and post them on the web, so if you've missed talks in the past, if you haven't been to talks this year, you've missed learning about the Higgs boson, the Large Hadron Collider, you've missed learning about evolution of microbes in polar ice, you've missed learning about the sun, a star in our own backyard. I'm going up to a little bit north of here later today to watch the eclipse tomorrow. Many of you are probably aware of this. You'll be able to see quite a significant partial eclipse in the Bay Area, or an annular eclipse from up further north. There's the transit of Venus coming up in next month that you may have heard about as well. There's a lot of events going on in astronomy. So we also have an astronomy talk third Saturday in July 21st. Dr. Jeff Silverman from the astronomy department here, talking about exploding stars, dark energy, and the runaway universe. He's a postdoc working with Alex Velpenko. Many of you have probably heard of Alex, so it should be an interesting one as well. So we're really trying to get kind of the breadth of science on campus, and that's one of the reasons why I'm delighted that Professor Ruth Tringham has agreed to speak. I've always found archaeology fascinating, and we both grew up in England, where I guess sort of being surrounded by all that history really kind of amazes you. But Ruth's going back even further than this, sort of deep into prehistory with some excavations on a site in Turkey, Catalhoyuk.
Very good.
And she's been working here at Berkeley in archaeology and now in the graduate school. Getting involved a lot in digital learning, read some stuff about Second Life, and some real kind of neat ways to bring the stories of the past to life, and that's what she's going to tell us about today. So, very pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm hoping that I'll be entertaining for you today. On this nice sunny day. I've had laryngitis all week thanks to too much fun on the water around Angel Island. If you're interested in how archaeology can be used differently, I can definitely recommend that you go to Angel Island any weekend between now and the end of June to see the Odyssey as it's being played theatrically around the basically archaeological buildings of Angel Island, this old fort, and then bringing in an entirely different scenario of the Odyssey. It's very fun. I lost my voice helping in it, but anyway, that's okay. I hope you can hear me. If my voice seems to be wavery, that's not because I'm nervous, it's because of the la voce. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the imagination, but how it articulates with the more empirical or scientific side of archaeology. And I'm very interested in the whole aspect of media literacy and how we interpret the media. So I'm going to begin quite a bit with actual publications and films, rather than going into the sort of whole theoretical side of it. So we're very used to historical fiction. I'm sure some of you know this very famous book by Jean Auel, The Clan of K-Bear. There's a whole series of them. And as with any kind of historical fiction, you want to know, or it's interesting to know, to what extent is this person who's writing the story immersed in the actual practice of archaeology, because that makes a difference, or to what extent is he or she really a good writer, a novelist. The two very, very rarely come together. This is a problem, and it's a shame, and maybe it will change, but it's a fact. So you might also know somebody, a really good writer. Jean Noel is obviously a very seductive writer. She's not an archaeologist. She is not certainly not a practicing archaeologist or even an academic one. Nor was Michael Crichton. He wrote The Eaters of the Dead. You might have seen it as a movie, I think The 13th Night, about the Vikings, Viking period, bringing in a whole idea of contact between Vikings and people in the Middle East. Very interesting book, really fascinating reading, but it's using fictional narratives very differently. It's using the imagination very differently from an archaeologist. Now, this archaeologist, Janet Spector, wrote What This All Means. This is one of the very first archaeological books which was really trying to articulate both the empirical material of the remains of archaeology from a Native American village, in this case, in Minnesota, with a fictional interpretation. She was one of the founders of feminist practice of archaeology, and was really doing this as an exercise in what could be done with the imagination if you really let it go. If you admitted to yourself as an archaeologist, this is a legitimate way of working. It's a really interesting book, and it's also well written. It's also very unusual. This is another one, more recent, by Kelly Carmine, called Creekside. She's also a practicing archaeologist, and again, it's writing about a Native American village in a period of contact between Europeans and Native Americans. Death by Theory is also written by an archaeologist. It's a very different kind of thing. It's taking a fictional story today, and it's a mystery story, and it's trying to bring in how archaeologists work into an actual sort of detective story. It's quite funny. I've used this one in teaching. I've also used Janet Spector's book in teaching, and it's a way of lightening some of the more heavy theoretical aspects of archaeology, or especially this one. He wrote one about field work as well. Adrian Pritzelis works in Sonoma State University. So now there's a more recent one. I'm not sure I would call this fiction. It's a kind of global history. It's written at a very different scale from any of these other books, these fiction books. It's written at the scale of evolutionary change. It's written by Stephen Mithen. It's called After the Ice. Stephen Mithen has also written a really fun non-fiction book called The Singing Neanderthals that you might want to read. He's an excellent writer, and he's an archaeologist, and he's all sorts of other he's worked a lot with the beginning of understanding the history of the brain, for example. So Stephen Mithen has written this book, which is it's sort of using the imagination about the global history of the Earth, but it's not really in the same scale as you might think of using the imagination in archaeology. Now, most people, when you've looked at archaeology on television, it would probably be a documentary, something like this, a very explicit, a very sober discourse, you might call it, of archaeology, very expository. It's telling you what you should think and presenting the data and giving you the facts. So it's this kind of thing.
Finally, it has attracted a new school of archaeologists who've used techniques from other sciences like sociology and anthropology. One of its leaders is Colin Renfrew, Professor of Archaeology at Cambridge.
Who built Stonehenge? Today, modern archaeology tends to think in terms of social and economic processes. And that means we think about the environment of society at the time. It means that we think about the farming situation and the production of food. It means we think about trade and try to study the links with other areas, including remote areas when such links took place.
So this is a very clear statement of what he thinks, although it's not a very personal statement. It's typical of the kind of documentary where you get a very impersonal statement about what might have happened. Obviously, he's had to use his imagination while he's writing this, but you get no sense of how he's used it. How does he come to know what he knows? Are there other interpretations? Does he feel uncertain about certain things? So there are very few TV movies that are made which might be called reflexive, reflecting upon who the author of the movie is, what he thinks or she thinks. And there are very few impressionistic things. And this is where I'm going to really begin to explore how you might legitimately use some of these more impressionistic or reflexive genres of filmmaking or book writing, but at the same time still retain your scientific method of working, your scientific process. There's a movie that I'm going to show you now, this one about the Iceman murder. It's called The Iceman Murder. At first, the movies that were made about Ötzi the Iceman, who was found in Italy, the Italian Alps, in the 1990s, it was 1980s, I believe, sorry, were very much about Ötzi the Iceman and what he was wearing and presenting all the materials that was found with him. He was found when he was found in the ice. And then since then, they've done enormous amounts of work on one skeleton because it's really the only one that's ever been found. And it's been studied in so much detail. It's incredible. It's amazing what you can do once you have this kind of data at that sort of age. This dates to 3500 BC. It's really early. There's no writing around. So this is a fantastic opportunity. And in this film, they really harvest that information. And they go through all of these different scenarios of how this guy ended up high up in the Alps by himself and obviously dead. Was it of exposure? Was it of, so that's the old sick shepherd idea, where he was thought to have perhaps been a transhuman shepherd coming up from the south of the Alps, bringing his sheep and getting lost or getting trapped in a freak storm. Another one is that he was a traveling smith. This was when they discovered he'd got a copper axe and that some other materials that would have been very difficult to make. So they're imagining now a traveling smith or a traveling trader going from one side of the Alps to the other and perhaps getting caught in a freak storm. So then they found, by some really very careful x-ray, that he'd got a little arrowhead stuck in his spine. So then the whole murder thing started up. And it became like a crime scene investigation, using imagination there. And so perhaps they thought he was actually murdered by someone for some crime he'd committed as a kind of individual act of revenge or whatever. Somebody followed him up from the south because it was an Alp. He was from the south. They showed that with some grasses, and that the arrowhead was from the south. They showed that by the shape in which it was made. And then so that they had that idea. Then they had the idea that perhaps he was a chieftain and that we're dealing here with a period of intertribal warfare. All of these, all of these kinds of information that they were taking could be interpreted by any one of these, or perhaps not the old sick shepherd, but anyway, that they could be interpreted in many different ways. For instance, with the old sick shepherd, they had taken the tattoos which were on his back and suggested that they were at pressure points, that even as early as that, they were able to use those pressure points to relieve his back pain, because he obviously had arthritis. But then that whole idea of the pressure points has gone away in the chieftain victim of intertribal warfare scenario. So I'll show you, you can see here how just all of these, when you've got enough information, it becomes an incredibly rich array of alternative scenarios, all of which are bringing to bear various sources for the imagination, things that people have read ethnographically or things that they've read from history and so on. So I'll just show you a little of this.
It was that of a man who had been trapped in the ice for 5,300 years, 1,000 years before the first pyramid. Throughout the entire history of civilization, he had lain here, unseen and untouched. They called the Iceman Otzi. With him, they found a treasure trove of belongings, tools, clothes, ornaments, weapons. But Otzi himself remained a mystery. Who was he? What did he do? Above all, how did he die? Many of the clues remained frozen inside the corpse. The 10 years of CSI science can now reveal an extraordinary picture of our past. The Iceman and his world can be brought to life. It's a world of mystery, magic.
So they're setting you up for a mystery there. It's a docudrama. There's a lot of reenactment there, which involves a whole different scale of use of the imagination. But a lot of the more recent movies, TV series, are using reenactment as a way of drawing you in to visualize for yourselves these kinds of possible scenarios. The scenarios themselves are quite legitimate. A few years ago, if some of these scenarios were used without so much information that you get from the Iceman, they would be called speculation. But with this Iceman, it's very different because you have so much information that you can begin to see that this is a really very legitimate way. You couldn't really do it without the imagination, without thinking of fitting these different empirical details to these different scenarios and weighing them and juggling them around. Now I'm going to show you a couple of fiction movies that have archaeologists as their consultants. Some of the other ones that you might know are, for instance, Apocalypto, which I wouldn't necessarily say is a really good example. Quest for Fire had archaeologists. The Eagle has an archaeologist as a consultant. And it makes a difference if you ever look at some of these fictional movies. It makes a difference to see, to be able to think of them. How authentic are they? How closely are they basing the clothing and the other reenactment materials on the archaeological data? Many movies that you might see, the majority of them use no archaeologists as their consultant. And so you really can't use them if you're interested in the past. You really can't use them for any kind of understanding of what went on. I mean, you can use them, obviously, but it's not something that would be reliable. This one, for example, is an old movie, relatively old. It's French, obviously, and has Gérard Depardieu as a paleontologist who has found and some early bones. And what he's doing is using his imagination to follow the path of how his skeleton that he's found, a really early hominid skeleton, has actually come to rest in this particular cliff. So she fell down, and he's here following her trail. So this is a way of using the imagination in which you're using her trace, but it's not a real. There's nothing there to see how she really fell, but he's filling in the gaps in between the actual empirical data that he has, which are the very small fragments of bone scattered down the hillside. So one of the things then, coming to this, how we deal with the use of the imagination in archaeology, is very important, is the actual documentation. But one of the things to remember, and I'll point out again, is that even as you document, as you select what you want to document, what you're actually looking for, what you're thinking about as you excavate, you're actually imagining, your imagination is running around actually creating some of the models. The digital documentation, digital online data, all of this is very solid, this is your empirical data. And at the moment, for the most part, we're trying to create these digital representations of these to actually be able to share them more easily, to be able to preserve them for a longer time. That's another story. Out of those, then, we have other ways in which we might try to interpret these ways in which we can actually expand through our imaginations. We can actually expand on the data, on the empirical data that we've found. This is obviously something that's fairly obvious, but yet you need to be able to separate out some of these more ephemeral interpretive means, these media. And one of the things I'll be coming back, there are a number here that I'm not going to really talk about very much at all, but the one I am interested in is the one called database narratives. So my first attempt at actually joining the empirical data of archaeology with interpretive fictional narratives was done way back in the 1990s, round about just after Janet Spector was writing hers. And I became very interested in this whole way in which, how far can we take the imagination? Can we take fictional narratives out of the archaeological data and still remain as something that people would find useful? People would find a legitimate exercise within the scientific archaeological process. When I first did this in the early 1990s, there was sort of outrage. You can't do this. This isn't science. This is just speculation. What I'd done was to take an archaeological site that I was excavating at that time in what's now Serbia, and I was trying to consider with my little thing here. Got my pointer somewhere. Oh well, yes, here it is. So I was trying to think of this site, which is the yellow in each case, is called Opovo, in 3 different scales. So it's actually a little earlier than Otzi the Iceman. It's an early agricultural settlement. It just was only in existence for about 200 years. And we could see it in the great swath of the millennium of global archaeology or European prehistory. It's very far away. Any of the inhabitants are very far away from our view there. So this is something, and it's quite safe then to talk about economic processes and stuff like that Colin Renfrew was talking about. But it doesn't really, I don't know about you, but it doesn't really excite me very much. It doesn't really grab my imagination. So then we can think of it getting a bit larger here into the half millennium. I say we've got 200 years out of this 500. But what about if we start to think about the 3 building horizons, one on top of the other, in terms of the generation. Then we can begin to familiarize, we can put into our own scale of living what this site was like. So we've got here perhaps several generations, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I was imagining. 7 generations in the duration of the settlement. And what if in those generations you've got people who are surviving throughout those generations? A great-grandmother, for example, could survive 2 or 3 of those generations. So here I began to actually put imagined people. People must have lived there, men, women, children of all different ages. So in prehistory, when you're dealing with prehistory, we have no historical documents. We don't really know, if we don't have burials, which we didn't in this site, we have no way of knowing how many females, how many males, who was there. And we have nothing about their histories. So we have to create them. We can create them. And so this is what I was doing, thinking of people who might have lived in this particular house at this particular time, and that would have been Baba's great-grandmother. So who's Baba? Baba is all the way up here. She's still surviving at the time of this excavation when it finished, or at the time of the settlement. And so the idea is that Baba set fire to the house because that's what they did all the time. When somebody died, or when an important person in the house, this is my imagined scenario, when they died, then somebody would have had to set light to the house. So then we have a whole series of stories about setting light to the house, and that was the whole premise of this of this thing called the Chimera Web, was to think about how they set fire to the house, how we know about fire, how do we know the houses were all burned in separate fires, because they all seem to be burned, but were they burned all at once, or were they burned in separate fires? So that needed a sort of arson investigation, which we did, and found that they're separate fires. So then we had to think about, we can share with people about the fire investigation, we can share with people about who the archaeologists are and how we excavate the burned houses. We can also have a story about the fire. And this is the kind of thing that I was working with, going from the burned remains of the houses, that's all we had as archaeologists, to imagine a whole scenario of why you would burn a house deliberately. One house, and then another house, and then another house in a single fire at different times. Why would you ever do that? So this takes, again, some looking in your imagined, or your sources for your imagination. Where are you going to get those from? And that's just another story, but that is one which is a really interesting one. It's my favorite scenario, and that's all I can say about it, is that it is my favorite scenario. I can't say it's better than some of the others, that the houses were burned because there was disease, or that they were burned because there were pests and they needed to clean out the settlement. But my favorite is that they burned down these wattle and daub houses as a way of flattening the houses and creating what became a permanent marker on the landscape of where the house had been. And so this is, that was the basis of this story. So this is, I don't know whether this all, this was the story that, or one of the ways in which I actually tried to link the imagination with the, actually you don't need to hear it, all you need to do is read this. It looks a little dorky because it's 1996, but it gets the point of trying to show how she could see, or she's showing how the remains of the old well can still be seen in the old house. So it's taking archaeological stratigraphy in this point and then building a story over it. So coming on then to the place where I've been excavating for the last 10 years. I haven't been back. I've finished that project now, and we're just in the process on September of publishing it, which will be fun. And this is at the site of Catalhoyuk that you might know because it's very famous with its painted walls, dates to about 7000 BC, was excavated in the 1960s in this area, and then starting in the 1990s and going on, I think, till the 2020s, is this is the tell, the Neolithic tell itself, the East Mound, and this is where all the archaeologists live. And this is where the excavation that I'll show you was happening. That's the Berkeley archaeologists at Catalhoyuk. And this was our project from 1997 to 2005, and we carried this out as part of the umbrella of the big project, which is run by Ian Hodder at Stanford University. And this is, well, I sort of explain to you a little about what we were doing.
Some archaeologists from different parts of the world came together to dig through the debris of a 9,000-year-old village in the middle of Turkey. Now the village is a mound covered in grass. But once there were mud brick houses here whose white plastered walls and floors were renewed each year. The archaeologists peel away the plastered floors of a house with incredible patience while listening to beautiful music. The house they are digging lies on top of other, earlier houses, and those houses lie on top of yet other, even earlier houses. In fact, when the house that our heroes are excavating was occupied, the village had already existed for 1,000 years. So it's not surprising that they were accustomed to having their relatives, both dead and alive, close by them in this place. They buried the dead relatives under the floors of the houses, digging the burial pits into the fill of the houses below. This is the story of the excavation of one of these ancestors, and what we, or at least one of us, think about as the face of the deceased is revealed. When I filmed this piece and added the music, only the skull had been revealed. From this you can't really tell the sex of the deceased, although you can say something about age and health and nutrition. However, when the following year the complete skeleton was revealed, it turned out indeed to be a mature woman in her mid-40s when she died, quite elderly for those times, who had lived a long and eventful life.
Anyway, she's got two episodes of broken ribs. I'm just looking at the right bit. The ribs on the left, broken ribs on the left side.
She's only about 40, 55, so it looks like she's very long. She's got some other infections for her stuff too, and osteoarthritis in the lower back.
Her story has yet to be told beyond sharing the fate of her cells died of, but she is not forgotten. That is what we do as archaeologists. Forget nothing and know.
I'll show you, I'm just going to run through there. That's one way in which I use the actual original video media from our excavation and have layered over it a voiceover and then actual music in a way which completely changes, I think, the way you might look at that data, the video footage, if you were looking at it without that sound. So this use of sound is actually quite a powerful and way in which you can add your imagined interpretation of the original data. The thing is that you can't do that in a book. You can only do that with some of the digital technology that we have available nowadays. And that's really, I suppose, has always been my attraction towards using the digital technology, using digital media and digital versions of the other data, is that we can do much more with drawing in and sharing our interpretations with the public. This is a book. This is a sort of classic, fictional account, as I showed you at the beginning, of some of the fictional accounts of archaeological materials. This one is by Rob Swigart, and it's called Stone Mirror. It's actually being a little coy about saying this is Catalhoyuk. He's calling it something else. And perhaps it's because it's an excavation which is still in progress. He didn't want to kind of talk about it. And the thing is that, as with many fictional accounts or fictional movies, he's not telling you really, he's not really making it transparent how he's relating the archaeological record with his imagined output. And in fact, he's doing it, this is not the archaeological excavation he describes in his story is not at all like the archaeological excavation at Catalhoyuk. So it's just as well he's not calling it Catalhoyuk, because if he did, then this would be classed as a fake fiction. It would be perhaps legitimate as true fiction, which it is. And it is true fiction. It's not even pretending to be a documentary account, or it's not even pretending to be the kind of thing I'm doing, which is to very closely make very transparent the relationship between my imagination and the archaeological data. So it's a different enterprise. And then in the making right now, we have a playwright from New York, Sinan Unel, who is actually creating a play about Catalhoyuk, and he's calling it Catalhoyuk. So he's caught in this conundrum of how do I make fictional characters in an actual archaeological site, an actual archaeological project. These aren't people. He's not dealing with real people there. I suggested he should, give fictional actions to his real people in his play, but he didn't want to do that. I think that's a kind of playwright's genre. You wouldn't want to do that. But it will be very interesting to see how he winds his way through this idea of not making it a fake, not making it a phony, but using the archaeological project as a taking off, as a springboard for his play. So that's another one. Let me show you another way. This is, again, I'll just show you a bit of this movie, which is actually making a video movie, what do we call music video, using the music of Chris Rosser as a song, and using that, again, just taking the actual materials, the media resources from the excavation. you'll recognize some of the same footage, right? You can use this footage again and again in a different context, and it looks completely different.
Back in my hometown, nothing seems the same, but it's frozen in my memory like the ruins of Pompeii. I must have buried my heart underneath this road. Stuck here on Main Street, like this lump in my throat, and it feels like archaeology, this digging of the past, unearth another part of me, things I never thought would last. Here in my old high school, it's been a lot of years, so why am I afraid just to walk in here? Hidden in these halls are artifacts and fragments of fear, buried and forgotten, thought they'd disappear. And it feels like archaeology, this digging of the past, another part of me, things I never thought would last and last and last. Oh. Now all my friends are gone, my parents moved away. This town sure grew up quickly, so the neighbors say. There's my old house, just off the interstate, and a duplex in the field where my sisters played. And it feels
So what that movie was actually made to show was how ephemeral our archaeological, not only are the houses of the past 9,000 years ago, but how ephemeral are our excavations. All of this activity that we did, it's all gone, and that's the whole idea of that our archaeological excavation itself becomes archaeological very quickly. So it's kind of trying to express my imagination of this place that was a home really every summer for 7 years is now not there. And this is another way of showing the same thing, which is what we call computational rephotography. And I want you to watch this corner that these people are walking across. This is taken in 2008. After our excavation finished, or was the scene you saw at the end of that film was 2004. So what this is allowing is for the excavated area, which was just there, to show up again, and all of the, so that you don't forget. It's this whole idea of forgetting and remembering, which is something that I'm very interested in, both in the past and even now. So this was another way of thinking about the site and getting visitors to think about the site as they walk across it. And we made some video walks. This is that same East Mound. This is where we were excavating. This is the compound. And we created some walks. And the walks go from, say, one place to another, but the idea was to get people thinking as they're doing the walking and to get them imagining as they're doing the walking. And you can see here, these are some various things that we want them to look at as they're going up the hill. And I did that in this guided tour, which you would have on your iPod, which was at that time, in 2005, a dream, but is now absolutely feasible. And this is what you would see as you're walking up you would see as you're walking up the hill with your iPad.
So its first element is an audio, a sound of feet on gravel, crunching on it, and then soft earth on that. Then a video clip of dusty feet that are ever present in the summer as you walk across the mountain.
This would be nice to watch if you were a visitor in the winter.
Another video of gophers, evidence of whose house building is everywhere in the mound, to the extent that she sometimes imagines there is a complete gopher city below.
So then this one will show you another of our attempts to use our imaginations and build out from the archaeological excavation at Catalhoyuk and to try to engage other people in our process of archaeology at the mound.
Two buzzards circle lazily in the air above burning mud brick houses, and the sounds of pigs, sheep, and children laughing echo around the settlement. The dig house at the bottom of the tell is only partially finished, but the party night bonfire crackles merrily behind it, casting strange shadows against the wheelbarrows leaning against the tool shed. Occasionally a robot, or a ninja, or a scantily clad woman will fly by.
That's mine, I'm Ruth Galileo.
But more often zooming off into the clouds to inspect the island as a whole. This is Catalhoyuk in Second Life.
So we used this for meetings, this area, we used it for meetings. It's now archaeological itself, unfortunately. I also used it as a place for improv theatre, you could call it, for a class to create the idea of hunting the aurochs and an accident that might happen. So these are avatars of actual students who are creating their own movement and action. And okay, enough of that one. And this finally is...
There's an opening in the roof, and that's the way how we can come into the house. So I come down the ladder that was here, like that, in the wall, and then leaning in the floor, leaning on the wall and up to the opening. So I come down and I step on this step here, kitchen, and I don't want to get that way because that's where the oven is, and it's hot and a little dirty around there. But then I had to come to this edge, and here we have a big threshold, and it's really white and beautiful, and it has spots of red paint down here on it, indicating that this is an important area. And so I have to clean my feet a little bit, and then I step into the central area. That is a large open area, which is very important because that area connects all the other areas in the building. So this is the central point in many ways. And we all walk through this area, but we, not all of us walk everywhere we want in this area. So some people, like the older people, only are allowed to sit on this platform or sit and sleep on this platform because this is where our ancestors were buried. And so this is a sacred place in the house. And the same goes with this platform as well. And so we children, we are allowed to play in the middle and sleep in the middle. And we are allowed also to go in the areas where food is kept, stored, and prepared. And so what I will do, I will...
Okay. So that you can see is Miriana. She is actually, she was using her imagination. None of that was real. You do know that. I forgot to tell you that, but I know that you caught that. And so there she was physically walking around this place, which is complete ruin, and trying to build, in her own mind, she was seeing the building as if it was a real place. You could tell that. And then I think it's quite a powerful tour. It goes up all the way through the whole house. And is a powerful way of showing how the imagination can really help the interpretation. So this is just a little sideline on the imagination in archaeology, which is, here I had sources for the archaeologist's imagination for the Chimera web, thinking of history, ethnohistory, ethnography, folklore, material science, and really your own personal experience. So some of this would be on the basis of documents, ethnographic documents, but others would be on the basis of experiments done by archaeologists or by material scientists to help fill out the gaps. And then your own personal experience. One of the problems for many students and many archaeologists is that we lack a personal experience of what it's like to subsist 5,000 or 9,000 years ago. How many, used to ask my students constantly, how many of you know how to milk a cow? No. How many of you ever milked a cow? There you go. Good. Well, you're way ahead of those students, those 19-year-olds, unfortunately. My sister is a sheep farmer, so I know all about that too. So there have been a couple of really interesting books that I'll draw your attention to, who have written just recently about the archaeological imagination and the use of the imagination. One of these is just come out by Michael Shanks, and it's called The Archaeological Imagination. And he's here suggesting that there are three components of an archaeological imagination, one of which is the kora, which is about the senses of place, places that are inhabited by people, a place and an event. Events, obviously, for the most part, being practiced or made by humans. And then this gets into the whole idea of studying these through field work and doing crime scene investigations, like the one I suggested for the fire. How do this kind of thing? Thinking about how would you interpret this? How can you deal with this stuff on the ground? And one of the examples of that, I would say, was that we had never seen a roof in these excavations at Catalhoyuk. We had no idea really what the roof was like, but we had seen traces of it in scars on the wall, which might have been a roof ladder, as James Millart, the original excavator in the 60s, had thought. But then, so we started to think about there has to be a roof, but what would a roof look like? And it was really interesting. We came upon the roof, the remains of the roof in that building that we were excavating. We had no idea what it was at first. It was all this very strange clay with very bright colored, I don't have a picture of it, bright colored lines on it. And it was our micromorphologist who had seen the remains of roofs, and Wendy Matthews, who knew what this kind of thing might look like. She'd seen it in other places, ethnographically, and in other areas of the Middle East. She was the one who said, this has got to be a roof. And we then did. But if we hadn't really, if we'd been looking for it, perhaps we would have found it. Maybe we were looking for it. We were always trying to find stuff in the remnants, all of the fill of the houses. That was the way that we worked, although many earlier archaeologists used to clear that stuff out as quickly as possible and get down to the floors where they thought the more interesting materials would be. But you see, when you go into the debris, that's where you really find the materials. It's like looking at the edges of things. It's where you find the interesting things. So anyway, that's the Cora. Then he suggested that there was also an area, components, a collection, pattern recognition, dealing with things, pattern recognition, presenting your data, sorting it, those kinds of things. And then metamorphosis would be to expand, how you expand with your imagination from the vestiges and traces into understanding things like entropy and the displacement of materials and how to conserve them and how to represent them. So that's what he's been writing. And then another recent book, an interesting one, is actually not a book, it's a chapter in the book of our excavation, which is going to be published in September, and that's the one called House Lives. And that's the idea that you can have a present viewing triangle and see how it articulates with a past viewing triangle. Michael Ashley wrote his dissertation on the vision, archaeology and vision, and created this vision hourglass with these different thinking about or using your imagination to imagine going from something that you in the present can view, like the burial, and then thinking how the past person might have viewed it, or how we might view it if it was in the past. So these different ways of articulations between past and present is a way of sorting out how you might use how you do use your imagination. Very, very valuable. So then we come quickly then to what's the value of it. And I just want to draw your attention to the idea of microhistories. That is quite a recent way of creating histories, historiographic genre, microhistories. It's been going since the 1980s, and you might know it, the kind of thing, by this book, Return of Martin Guerre, or the film that it was actually its instigator. So the idea of microhistories that's been written by this guy, Seato, has been suggested is that in history, when you write a microhistory, you're writing a narrative that's very closely associated with the primary documentation and empirical sources. And it brings you face to face with individual actors of the past and immerses you through these imagined extensions, which are the imagined stories, the imagined narratives. You can immerse yourself in the experience of the everyday. This is a very different way of writing history from the history writ large, which is what we're usually used to. The kind of thing I was showing you, that the global book about global history, global archaeology at the beginning. So some other, this kind of history writing was started by Carlo Ginzburg and some others in Italy in the mid-1980s, and some other examples that you might have heard about, in addition to the Return of Martin Guerre, is The Beggar and Professor by Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, who has written also about the villages. These are all mostly 16th century, all writing, using documents, especially legal documents in the 16th century. And then The Great Cat Massacre, which is about 18th century France. So these are all printed books. One of the things that you have to do as you're reading the story, you're constantly having to find the end note, which tells you about the source. So you're having to go back and forth, which I find really cumbersome. And it's one thing that really puts me off when I'm reading these micro-histories, which are really often very interesting. This was Beggar and the Professor is a travel saga through Europe in the 16th century, incredibly descriptive. So I come to this idea of, if we wanted to do micro-histories for archaeology and use digital sources, how would we do that? So I come to the final part of my presentation here, which is to talk about database narratives. And this is creating databases. These are my two inspirations, Lev Manovich from UC San Diego and Steve Anderson from USC, who have created these digital recombinant histories or micro-histories, but digital, drawing out of databases their narratives. In this case, they're not really fictional. Well, I'm not sure whether we'd call them fictional. But in this case, what I'm trying to do here is take our database from Catalhoyuk, the Last House on the Hill database, with its people, places, things, and media, all of those things that you remember were in Michael Shanks's book, and then out of them, drawing this outer circle of using my imagination, drawing out of the database to create narratives, which in this case is the one that I'm working on right now. It's called Dead Women Do Tell Tales. And this is drawing out of the database called Last House on the Hill. House Lives is the printed volume that we are forced to make because that's what's expected and still. And the digital version is Last House on the Hill. Then Dead Women Do Tell Tales is something that I've been really interested in for some time. This is the Last House on the Hill database, which is a whole database of relating people, places, and things all across our media and our textual documents, including the printed document itself. And then being able to draw from that these materials. So you see here, this multiple burials, and drawing out of those the dead women do tell tales. So I'm drawing some elements from there, like a video here, an image here, various texts, and they come in to become elements in these micro-histories of Dead Women Do Tell Tales. So this is what Dead Women Do Tell Tales is in. At the moment, it's created in Personal Brain, or The Brain as it's called. And I've got five micro-histories with these overlapping entities. And so the entities are all mostly drawn from the database itself. I'm not sure if you can see these, but these are some of the 5 entities that are so far created. And the entities actually overlap. Some entities will occur in more than one micro-history. So this is, again, taking that idea that an image or a video can be seen in one context and then in another and appear completely, have a completely different impression for you, or different kinds of information. So these entities are in some cases drawn from the database, like the media entities. Then others are fictional creative pieces. And I'm not sure if I have time to show you one. I'll show you one excerpt here, because I know I should stop now. So this is the aerial photograph.
This is the Bach area as it looked in 2000, looking towards the west. The photographer is standing on a ladder about 15 feet above the action, so the image is at an angle from vertical. It shows a busy day in the life of the excavation of Building 3, where at least...
Okay.
Four individuals were buried under the floors of this platform, all probably at different times. The earliest were two immature adults. That's feature 644 and 634 rather. Then a woman, aged about 45, was...
Oops. Sorry. Just wanted to... there we go. I want to get to one of these creative... Okay. So you see the grave there.
We place our dear ones in a cave under the ancestral platform of the house. It's like a cave below the surface. You might understand what I am saying better if I say it is a container, because in a cave you can move around, but our dear ones must not move too much. So we dig a container for them under the earth, like those containers that you saw I had dug for storing our grasses and nuts. We even line the container with a basket, like we do for the food. I know that's so that small foods don't get lost in the earth. I think that's the same with people, because it's...
Okay, so that's, it goes on. So I wanted to just show you that kind of fictional, the fictional thing is taking an idea that there's an ethnographer, like in Michael Crichton's Eating of the Dead, there's some kind of a visitor to the site, and the visitor, he or she, is being instructed by the various villagers, as ethnographic informants do, about the kinds of things that go on in the village. And so there are various ways, those are interconnected in this particular microhistory, which is the one called Dido after that. So I'm going to finish now with a movie which I really like. It's from the TV series. It's just a 1-minute movie. And I feel that it's a narrative.
Archaeologists.
Oh, it's starting.
The question
It'll speak for itself.
Is not a useful one. You see, we deal in the tangible, the measurable. But when we dig into the ground, perhaps we're opening the pages of a book and reading the first line of the first chapter. Once upon a time there was a man. Once upon a time there was a woman. We can know what height they were. We can learn what they wore or what they ate. But can we know what moods touched them? The dreams they had? The loves? What we do know is that people do not fit into boxes. And therefore, neither does the history they make. Human life isn't straight and rigid. It's kinked. It's at an angle. And if archaeologists don't from time to time use their imagination, well, then they are in danger of missing those kinks. Yes, we need evidence. But evidence will only get us so far, and then we need to dream a little. Because it's by dreaming that we can make that vital leap back into another time. Dreaming isn't without its risks. It's ridicule. It's ruin, even. We have to be brave enough to take such a step. And some are braver than others. So.
Well, I think that says it all. Thank you.
Thanks for a fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I'm sure there are some questions.
Do you want me to do something with the...
So I just want to say that for those of us who are significantly older than today's undergraduates, I have a great deal of envy for the young. What an exciting time Blake tells us that imagination is our salvation. So I really was excited by this.
He's right. And it's never too late to start. Yes.
Well, I'd like to thank you for your very, very fascinating talk. But you sent a shiver through my soul. I get the impression that books are on their way out.
Oh.
You made a few derogatory.
Well, yes, I know. I shouldn't have done that. This is on tape, and I'll never.
This is really a question. I think for those of us who are older, we're used to books and we find comfort in them. And although I think it's very exciting, these new media, I don't feel comfortable with them as I do with something perhaps more staid.
Yes. Well, I agree with you. I always read. I've always got a book going, as well as listening to not at the same time, but I'm also listening to various stories as I drive, when on my iPhone. And so I think that the physical holding of a book and turning the pages still can't be replaced, however nice the iPad does it, or the.
But I think it's going to be replaced.
Well, I'm not sure. Maybe. Well, it will be certainly not the only. It'll be not replaced.
It'll take a long time.
I don't know if it'll ever go out, but it may. But I would say that one of the problems with archaeological publication is that when we publish something, one of our monographs is very big. We can't publish most of the images, and they can't be published in color because it's too expensive. And the whole thing is always, it's always representing just a fraction of the whole data. So that's why, that's one of the original reasons why we went with a digital mirror, which is actually a distorted mirror. It's got much more than the printed volume. But the libraries still want the printed volume. But, I don't know whether that's the kind of book. They're very, they're big. They're not very...
Your points are very well taken. That was just my reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I know that there's a wonderful book called The Books Without Ends, or The End of Books.
Oh, very clever.
Very nice
Can I ask
book.
a follow-up question?
Yes,
from that?
you got, okay, no problem.
Since you're looking at prehistory here, this is sort of before books,
Mm-hmm.
and we're thinking about kind of potentially the end of books, but at least there's always been storytelling, and these people must have told stories to each other as they were gathered around the fire or whatever. And some of that presumably has been preserved in some way or another, passed down in
Oral
histories,
history.
maybe. Is there any way that you can
For a
get
thousand,
to that?
for 1,000 years, thousands of years. There are, perhaps, you would always have to think very carefully about how you use that, whether you think it's true. There was, my first project was in Serbia, a place called Celovac. And when we went there first, there was this rumor, or it was a story, a folk tale. But they said it was, they said it as though it was part of their history, these villagers. And they said, oh yeah, you're going to excavate up there, Staro Selo. Yeah, there used to be an old village there. It was full of houses, and the houses were so close together that a cat could jump from one roof to another. And the houses they were like a meter away from each other. We didn't find a cat for ages, and then we did find one. So, what do I say about that? There was nothing after the village, after the Neolithic village that we were excavating, which was the same as Opovo, about 5,000 BC. After that, there was nothing except fields. There was no later occupation. So, I don't know. There have been books that have written about that in England. Can't remember who it was. Was it Peter Fowler or somebody like that? Was actually looking at folklore, oral histories, and actually being passed down from prehistory. Prehistory in most cases, though, for all of us, is several thousand years of continuity. But, you know, things might be. Yes?
My question is,
Oh, sorry.
language. Do we have any evidence?
No, I wish I'd shown a little more of the Iceman movie, because they've got some sort of made-up language that they're using in their reenactment.
Because presumably have quite limited language. Or linguistics told us that people back then had 10,000 of their words to use.
There's actually there's some really interesting papers and ideas that have been written about language, but and trying to take it back. Like with the Indo-European languages, Colin Renfrew, who you saw in the first movie, wrote a whole book about archaeology and the Indo-Europeans and language, and was of the opinion that the early agriculturalists, the early farmers, such as Opovo, Catalhoyuk, Selovats, all of those, that they were the early Indo-European speaking, sort of working backwards from that. Although that's, again, it's not entirely accepted. So there, but
my grandfather, who was a farmer, didn't have any words.
He didn't have any words.
He was silent. He was silent a lot of the time.
Was he?
Not fine.
Maybe he couldn't hear very well.
Maybe he was just a silent person.
Right. Actually, the main consensus is that the people at 9,000 years ago had a very rich social relationships, and that they had quite a complex social life, probably reflecting complexities of language. It's possible that they had no words for snow, although it does snow there, but that they had limited words for snow, as we do, but that they had many, many words for grass and other things. So you can begin to speculate on that, or even take it into an imaginative fictional narrative. There was another very interesting, if you've ever seen Quest for Fire, there's a very interesting, that's between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. It's, and they were having a consultant who was, God, what was his name? Can't remember, but who was very interested in behavior and body language, as well as spoken language, and was had the actors, none of the actors spoke anything that you could understand. They had, sometimes they had subtitles, but that he was making a contrast between the strong silent types like your grandfather, the Neanderthals, who needed very little vocalization to express what they wanted. They did it a lot with body language and other forms of speech. So they were a relatively quiet, it was a sort of quiet time. And then you had the Homo sapiens who were just chattering nonstop. And so, you know, there was that kind of idea. Again, it's a fictional movie, but following through, what fiction does is allow you to follow through and test, well, what would it be like if it was really like that? You've been having a question here, yes?
I'm not sure what the purpose of the media projects are that you mentioned, but I'm thinking of it from the point of view of making presentations at a public library, and it's kind of a broad set of presentations, but it would include Catalhoyuk, and so as I looked at the media, some of it really struck me as very interesting and engaging to the public, and some of it not. So the first thing that really caught me was the opera soundtrack and the scraping of the skull. I mean, there was something that was dramatic and that was symbolic, and it was really, really nice. There was a later sequence you showed where there was a woman walking over a floor plan, and she was imagining the kitchen and so on.
Right.
I did not find that.
Oh, you didn't find that? See, I found that really interesting.
But you're an archaeologist.
Well, yes, that's right.
And so
That's good to know. That's why we have user groups.
but on the other hand, when there were avatars and a virtual scene,
Mm-hmm.
like the hunting of the auroch, that seemed kind of like there wasn't a lot of activity in it, but it was that kind of thing seems more real immediately for those who don't know much about
Right.
archaeology and aren't going to be maybe so entranced with the particular findings or techniques of the archaeologists.
Yeah, it's really good to know. It's always good to hear the user, because it's always a surprise. Well, it's often a surprise. And our job is, when we're doing these, a lot of this stuff I do for myself. Like I did that, the 2010 movie, really I did it for myself because I was so annoyed that they just covered over our place and never put a sign. Here was the Bach excavation for 7 years. And so I thought, I'm going to make this movie, and I loved the song. But you're quite right. I think one of the things about our responsibility, and including in the Second Life stuff, which, as I said, is all now defunct, because we couldn't afford to pay their new dues. That I will say for the tape. They Second Life took away the educational discount, and so then we couldn't do it. But I think there's tremendous potential also for creating not video games, but computer games, actual sort of, the kind of thing that's played online, those kinds of things. I really would like to do that. But with all of this stuff, I think it's our responsibility, whether or not it's going to be beautiful or aesthetically pleasing or immersing or exciting, that we need to be able to show the transparency of how we got to the creation from the actual empirical data. I think that's really our responsibility. But the point is that as you said, there are some things, some places where you can do it. You can do both. You can make it aesthetically pleasing. And that's one of my dreams, is to be able to do that, to make both aesthetically pleasing and not dorky looking and not boring. But I'll remember that one about the walking across the land, But you see, Steve liked it, so that was okay. Yes.
I have, it's very interesting, really enjoyed your talk, but I see a potential gotcha or danger in the blending of facts and fiction and potential misuse of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because we see a lot of that, in classrooms and things where I think things are being introduced that have a business there, such as creationism. Do you see a danger there?
I see that there's always that potential is around, even without the digital materials. I think that if we make our media and our data openly accessible to everyone, which is what we intend, there's always the danger that it will be misused. But the main thing is that it goes with a Creative Commons license, which says that you need to attribute, if you're going to use this, you should attribute it to the original author or the original place where you got it. And that's actually embedded in the image itself, or the video itself. I think that, again, we can't, if we don't make it accessible, there's always that risk that it will be misused. But if we don't make it accessible, then it will get forgotten and lost and will become archaeological itself. So the main thing is that our data should remain in archived so that its original use or its original appearance and structure and everything and metadata are right there for the long term. And if people are then going to reuse our stuff in ways that I don't agree, then I can choose to comment, I can choose to, but I can't tell them not to use it. It's actually an ongoing conversation right now, big debate in the World Archaeology Congress, which is our big sort of global society, about open access and how open should we make our materials. So it is a problem, because there are some materials that are very sensitive, that people might not want to have shared. So we have to, respect that. And there are ways, we're all working on ways in which, especially this non-profit that I'm working with right now, the Center for Digital Archaeology, which is developing ways in which you can guarantee that those who, with the restricted rights, or the people who want a restricted access are respected, but at the same time the other materials can be looked at. So there are ways in which you can get around it.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.